The first ball of the season at Marchwood House was the sort of room built to make a person feel small, and Honoria Vane stood at the edge of it in a gown the color of weak tea, counting the candles rather than the dancers. There were more than 200 candles, she decided, and not one of them was looking at her. The orchestra had begun a country dance, and the floor had filled with silk and laughter, and the high, bright noise of young women who had not yet learned that a season could end without a single hand offered. Honoria had learned it. She had learned it 8 years running, and she had stopped minding the way one stops minding a cold that never quite leaves behind her. A fan opened, with a small, decisive snap, and a voice she knew too well pitched itself to carry. "The Vane girl is here again," said Lady Caro, the Dowager Marchioness, to whatever companion stood at her elbow. "One admires the persistence, though at her age, it is less persistence than habit. A spinster does so love a familiar wall to hold up." The word landed where it was meant to land. Spinster! Honoria did not turn. She had taught herself not to turn, because turning was what they wanted, and the smallest dignity left to her was the refusal of it. She kept her eyes on the candles and her gloved hands folded at her waist, and she breathed in for a count of 4, the way her mother had taught her a lifetime ago, when there had still been a mother to teach her things. What the room did not know, what it had never troubled itself to learn, was that the plain woman against the wall had a reason to be there that had nothing to do with husbands. Her niece sat in the chairs reserved for girls not yet out, a slight figure of 17 with her dead mother's chin, and Honoria had come to watch over her because there was no one else left to do it. That was the wound the room could not see. And the story is the slow uncovering of it. Stay with me, and I will show you a woman the world had decided not to look at, finally looked at by the one man no one in that room dared approach. Honoria's sister Margaret had died 2 winters past, of a fever that took her in 9 days, and had left behind a husband too broken to be useful, and a daughter named Clara, who needed someone to teach her how to stand in a ballroom without weeping. Honoria had given up what little remained of her own marriageable years to do it. She had moved into her brother-in-law's narrow house on Cavendish Street, had let out her own small income to cover Clara's gowns, and had walked into this season not as a candidate, but as a guardian, which the room read as the same pathetic thing it always read. There had been a time before, the 8 years, when Honoria had stood in rooms like this one with her own card half-filled and her own hopes unembarrassed. She had been 23 then, not beautiful but not invisible either, with a small dowry and a quick tongue she had not yet learned to hide. A curate had courted her one summer and thought better of it by autumn. Widowed Colonel had considered her and chosen a younger woman with a larger settlement, and had told Honoria so to her face, kindly, as though kindness improved it. She had not minded the Colonel. She had minded the slow accumulation of such mornings, each one teaching the same lesson, until the lesson had become the floor she stood on. By 26 she had stopped having her hopes embarrassed by the simple expedient of having none. And then Margaret had died, and there had been Clara to think of, and the question of Honoria's own future had quietly closed, like a book no one was reading. She was 28 now. She wore her hair in the plain knot of a woman who no longer dressed it for anyone, and her gloves had been mended twice at the thumb, and the tea-colored gown had been turned and retrimmed until the fabric had begun to give up its color the way she had given up her claims. None of it was poverty. Exactly. It was the careful management of too little, which is a particular skill, and Honoria had become its quiet mistress. She watched Clara now across the floor. The girl was speaking with a cluster of debutantes, and Honoria could see from the set of her shoulders that she was frightened, and could see, too, the precise moment the other girls turned their backs in that small, cruel choreography, the young learned so early. Inden. Clara's face went white. Honoria began to move along the wall toward her. Unhurried, because hurry would only draw the eyes she had spent 8 years learning to evade. She did not reach her niece before the gentleman did. He came from the far side of the room where the older men stood with their brandy and their politics, and he crossed the floor against the grain of the dance so that couples had to part to let him through. He was tall, broad through the shoulder, dressed in a coat of so deep a blue. It was nearly black, and his face was the kind of still that other faces arranged themselves around without meaning to. Honoria knew who he was, the way everyone in the room knew, the Duke of Westmere. A man who had not danced in 3 years, who came to these rooms and stood at their edges and left early, and whose name the matchmaking mothers spoke in a particular hush, half hunger and half fear. He stopped before Clara. He said something Honoria could not hear, and then he turned, scanned the wall once with a slow, deliberate sweep, and found Honoria where she stood and did not look away. She felt it before she understood it, a warmth climbing her throat that had no business being there. He inclined his head a fraction, the smallest courtesy, and the heat in her face deepened, and she thought, he has mistaken me for someone. He could not be looking at her. Men like the Duke of Westmere did not look at women like Honoria Vane. Her wound had told her so for 8 years, and her wound was a patient and persistent teacher, and she believed it the way one believes the floor will hold. The Duke escorted Clara back toward the chaperons, and his path brought him within 3 feet of Honoria, and he stopped. "You are the aunt," he said. His voice was low and level, a voice that did not need volume because it had never once been ignored. "I am Miss Vane," Honoria said. "I thank you for your kindness to my niece. It was not kindness." He looked at her a moment longer. Then was strictly proper. The girls were cruel, and she was alone. "I dislike cruelty." He said it the way another man might remark on the weather, and then he bowed. The correct, shallow bow, and was gone before she could decide whether she had imagined the whole of it. Lady Caro had seen. Of course she had seen. Across the room her fan had stilled at exactly the wrong height, and beside her a young woman in ice-blue silk was watching Honoria with the flat, assessing look of a creature deciding whether a thing was prey or merely beneath notice. That Honoria would learn was Miss Petra Sedley, the season's acknowledged diamond, 20 years old and already spoken of as the natural Duchess the Duke of Westmere would eventually sensibly choose. The carriage home was cold, and Clara wept against Honoria's shoulder in the dark, and Honoria stroked her hair and said the things one says, that the girls were silly, that it did not signify, that next week would be better. Inside her glove her own fingers found the small, worn shape she carried always, her mother's enameled thimble, blue and gold, and rubbed nearly smooth at the rim, and she pressed her thumb against it the way she had since she was a child, afraid of the dark. It was the one thing of her mother's she had kept when everything else had been sold. She did not tell Clara that her own heart was beating in a way it had not beaten in 8 years, because that was a foolishness she would not permit even in herself. In the days that followed, the Duke of Westmere appeared where he had no reason to appear. He was at the lending library on Bond Street the morning Honoria took Clara to change her books, standing among the shelves with no book in his hand, and he bowed and inquired after the girl's spirits with a gravity that made Clara blush and stammer. He was at the modest concert in Hanover Square that the Vanes could just afford, seated 2 rows behind them, and Honoria felt the weight of his attention on the back of her neck through the whole of the second movement, and did not once turn around, though her body knew exactly where he sat the way a compass knows north. At the library he had stood near enough that she caught the scent of cold rain and clean wool from his coat, and he had asked Clara whether she had found anything to her taste, and when the girl named a novel he had said gravely that he had heard it was very fine, though Honoria would have wagered a great deal that the Duke of Westmere had never opened a lady's novel in his life. He had said it to make the girl easy. Honoria had noted that, and filed it, and not known what to do with it. At the concert he had not spoken at all. He had simply been there, 2 rows behind, and, at the end of the slow movement, she had let her gaze drift sideways and back, and had caught, in that half-second, that he was not watching the musicians. He was watching the back of her bent neck. She had faced front again so quickly the room had tilted. She told herself it was Clara. A duke who disliked cruelty had taken an interest in a motherless girl, and that was the beginning and end of it. She built the explanation carefully and lived inside it, and it held because she needed it to hold. And it did. It was at the Ashworth dinner that the dismissive word found her a second time, and this time it was said to her face. The dinner was a crush of 40 people, and Honoria had been seated below the salt, among the poor relations and the elderly companions, which was correct and which she had expected. Lady Caro, passing behind her chair on the way to the drawing-room, paused and laid a cool-gloved hand on Honoria's shoulder in a parody of affection. "My dear Miss Vane," she said, loud enough for the 6 people nearest to hear, "you must not let the child exhaust you. A spinster of your years wants her rest. Send her with a proper chaperone and stay home. No one will think the less of you. No one thinks of you at all." She smiled, patted twice, and moved on, leaving the words to do their work in the silence behind her. Honoria sat very still. The candle flames doubled and swam, and she would not let them fall, and she fixed her gaze on the white cloth and the silver, and counted her breaths, 4 in and 4 out, and did not give the table the satisfaction of a wet cheek. Down the table a gentleman laughed at something, oblivious, and then, from the head of the table where the rank was seated, a chair scraped, and the Duke of Westmere stood. "Lady Caro," he said. The whole table turned. "I find I require Miss Vane's opinion on a matter of music. She is, I am told, the finest judge of a pianoforte in this room." It was an absurd thing to say. He could not have known whether she played at all. Yet he said it with such flat certainty that no one dared laugh. And he came down the long table and offered Honoria his arm in front of 40 people, and there was nothing for her to do but take it. In the drawing-room he led her to the instrument and stood beside it, while she played, and she played the only piece she trusted, a slow air her mother had loved, and her hands did not shake, though she half expected them to. When she finished, he said quietly, "So only she could hear. You did not need rescuing. You should not have had to sit through it all the same." And then, before she could answer, "Eat something." "You have eaten nothing all evening." I watched. She looked up at him then, truly looked, and saw past the stillness for the first time. There was something behind it that she recognized, because she carried it herself. Grief, worn smooth with handling. He had not been merely cold. He had been holding something the way she held her thimble, a thing too tender to set down. "Why do you watch me?" she asked. It was bolder than she had ever been. He did not answer at once. "Because no one else does," he said. "And someone should." Then the dowager's party swept into the room and the moment closed like a door, and he bowed and withdrew to the men, and Honoria was left with her heart going like a struck bell, and the certain knowledge that her careful explanation had just developed a crack she could not mend. I will tell you what she did not yet know. The thing the room would not have believed of the Duke of Westmere had been shouted from the gallery. 3 years before, he had a younger brother named Theodore, bright and reckless and beloved, who had fallen in with a fast set and a faster pace of debt, and who had come to the Duke one autumn night, begging to be saved from a ruin of his own making. And the Duke, who was then a harder and prouder man, had refused him. He had said the boy must learn the cost of his choices. Theodore had ridden out into a December storm to plead with a creditor, and had not come home, and they had found him 2 days later, and the Duke had buried his brother and his pride in the same frozen ground. The Duke had been at his desk that night, with the ledgers open and the candle low, when Theodore had come to him with his coat undone and his hands unsteady, and had asked, not grandly but like a frightened boy, to be saved. And the Duke had looked at the figures, which were very bad, and had felt the cold satisfaction of the man who has ordered his own affairs well looking upon the man who has not, and he had said that Theodore must go to the creditor himself and make his own terms, and learn what his pleasures had cost. He had believed he was teaching a lesson. He had believed there would be a morning after, in which the lesson would be learned and the brother chastened and the bond between them the stronger for it. There had been no morning after. There had been a man at the door 2 days later, with his hat in his hands, and a long cold ride, and a thing under a sheet that the Duke had insisted on seeing for himself. What he had learned in that grave was the thing the ballrooms could not teach. He had learned that the world is generous to the polished and the placed, and merciless to anyone who has slipped its grip, and that the cruelty is never loud. It is a fan held too high, it is a chair sent home empty, it is a woman against a wall whom 200 candles refuse to light. He had sworn over his brother that he would never again stand silent, while the strong amused themselves at the cost of the alone. And then, at Marchwood House, he had seen a plain woman in a tea-colored gown cross a ballroom, unhurried to reach a frightened girl, asking nothing, expecting nothing, and something in him that had been frozen for 3 years had cracked at the edge. He told her none of this, he only watched, and crossed rooms, and issued his strange flat commands. And Honoria, who had been taught she was invisible, began against all her training to feel seen. The witnessing that fixed it happened on a gray afternoon in the gardens behind Westmere's townhouse, where the Duke had invited the Vanes to take tea with the express purpose, he claimed, of letting Clara meet his young ward, a solemn child of 9 named Beatrice, who had lost both parents to the same fever that had taken Margaret. Honoria had not known he kept the child. The room had said the Duke of Westmere was cold and childless and shut. The room had been wrong about a great many things. She found the little girl at the bottom of the garden, crouched over a fledgling that had fallen from the high hedge, weeping in the silent way of children who have learned that weeping brings no help. Honoria knelt in the wet grass without a thought for her gown, and showed the child how to make a nest of her cupped hands, and how to carry the bird to the gardener's shed where it might be warmed, and she sat with Beatrice on an overturned crate for the better part of an hour, teaching her the names of the birds that came to the feeder and inventing, when she ran out of true names, better ones. Beatrice had not spoken to anyone in the household above a whisper since the spring. The housekeeper had told them at the door in the low, confiding way of servants who love a child and cannot reach her. The child, however, spoke to Honoria. She spoke first about the bird, and then about the gardener's cat that frightened the birds, and then, in the smallest voice, about her mother, who had also known the names of birds, and had also made nests of her hands. Honoria did not flinch from the dead mother, the way the household evidently had. She asked what color the mother's hair had been, and whether she had sung, and let the child build her grief into something that could be spoken aloud in a garden on a gray afternoon, which is the only thing that ever helps. The fledgling stirred in the warm dark of the shed and gave a thin cheep, and Beatrice laughed, a startled rusty sound as though she had forgotten she owned the noise. She did not know. The Duke stood at the garden door the whole of that hour. She did not know he watched her wipe the child's face with her own handkerchief, the good one, the only one without a mend. She did not know that when he turned away at last, he stood a long while in his study with his hand pressed flat against the cold glass. It was after that afternoon that Lady Caro's campaign turned from contempt to alarm, because contempt is what the strong feel toward the harmless, and alarm is what they feel when the harmless threatens to become something else. She had a plan for the Duke of Westmere, and the plan was Miss Sedley, and the plan had been agreed in the language the dowagers spoke among themselves long before any party to it had been consulted. A plain spinster aunt was not in the plan, so the dowager did what such women do. She did not raise her voice. She wrote letters. She let it be known, in the soft, poisonous way of drawing rooms, that the vain woman was angling, that she had thrown her niece in the Duke's path as bait, and meant to catch him for herself, an aging fortune-hunter dressed as a guardian, and that a man of his rank could surely see the vulgarity of it. There is a particular machinery to ruin in such circles, and Lady Caro knew every gear of it. She did not accuse. Accusation could be answered. She wondered aloud. She was concerned. She had heard, she could not think where, that the vain woman's devotion to the niece was perhaps not quite so disinterested as it appeared, and was it not a little strange, when one considered it, how often the aunt contrived to be where the Duke was. She said it to the women who carried news the way water carries a current, and she said it with a sorrowful little shake of the head that made the hearer feel wise and kind for believing her, and within a fortnight the thing had detached from her entirely, and become simply what people knew. The story was clever because it took everything true about Honoria: her devotion, her presence at the edges of his life, her plain gowns, and turned each into evidence of its opposite. By the week of the Carol Ball, the story had done its work, and Honoria walked into rooms that had merely ignored her before, and felt now the colder thing, the active cut, the turned shoulder that knew exactly what it was doing. She bore it. She had borne worse. Even so, she began to keep Clara home, and she stopped going where the Duke might be, because she could not bear that her presence should become a thing said about him, and because some treacherous part of her had begun to hope, and hope, she had learned, was the most expensive thing a woman in her position could permit herself. He came to Cavendish Street. He had never called there. No one of his rank called at such a house. He came on a wet Tuesday with the rain darkening the shoulders of his coat, and he was shown into the cramped front parlor that Honoria had tried and failed to make grand, and he stood in it filling it, and he did not sit, though she offered. "You have stopped appearing," he said. "I thought it best." For whom? She could not say for you, and she would not say for me, so she said nothing, and looked at the worn carpet, and felt him cross the small room until he stood close enough that she had to tip her head to meet his eyes. He lifted one hand as though he would touch her face, and stopped, his fingers a breath from her jaw, close enough that she felt the warmth of them. And neither of them moved, and the rain ran down the glass, and the clock on the mantel ticked through a silence that lasted a small eternity. "I have spent 3 years," he said, very low, "being told what a sensible man wants. Sensible man wants a young wife and a quiet alliance and a face that flatters his table. I have been the most sensible man in England, and I have been cold to the bone the whole of it." His hand was still raised, still not touching. "I do not want a sensible thing. I want the woman who knelt in my wet garden for a child, not her own, and did not know I saw. I have wanted nothing in 3 years. I want that." It was the want named aloud, the thing the niche of her life had never once offered her, and Honoria's whole body answered it before her mind could intervene, a heat and a trembling and an ache to close the last small distance. She did not close it. She made herself step back, one step, though it cost her more than the 8 years had cost her. "You do not know what they are saying," she said. "If you choose me, you will pay for it. Your friends, your name, your ward's future. They will say you were caught by a fortune hunter. Twice your sense. I will not be the ruin of you. I have watched ruin. I will not author it." Something moved across his face, something that had to do with the brother in the frozen ground, though she did not yet know its shape. "I have been ruined by being sensible," he said. "I will take the other kind." But he did not press her. He lowered his hand, he bowed, and before he left, he said, with the old flat certainty that she had come to understand was the sound of him holding himself together, "Come to the Carol Ball on Thursday. Bring Clara. Whatever happens there, do not run from the room. Promise me you will not run." She did not promise. He left without the promise, and she stood at the dark window long after his carriage had gone, her thumb working the smooth rim of the thimble in her glove, and she let herself, for one unguarded hour, imagine the impossible thing. If this story has reached you, if you have ever stood at the edge of a bright room and counted the candles, because no one would count you, stay until the end. I think you will want to see what the candles saw. The Carol Ball was the grandest of the season, and Lady Caro had built it as one builds a stage because she intended that night to settle the question of the Duke of Westmere in front of every person whose opinion she valued. Petra was placed near the head of the room, in a gown of silver tissue that cost more than the vain household spent in a year, and the dancing had been arranged, and the supper had been arranged, and the whole evening tilted toward a single foregone conclusion, the way a floor tilts toward a drain. Honoria came because she had not promised not to, and because Clara begged to come, and because some flint-hard thing at the center of her refused at the last to give the dowager the victory of her absence. She wore the tea-colored gown again. She had nothing better. and she had decided she would not pretend to be. Other than she was, she stood Clara among the chaperones and took up her own place against the wall. The familiar wall, and the room saw her and the story the room had been told, arranged its face accordingly. Lady Caro approached early while the floor was still filling, and she brought Petra on her arm, and she spoke the dismissive word for the third time, in its third setting, and this time she dressed it as concern delivered to a witness, so that the rival might hear and the cruelty might wear a kind face. "Miss Sedley, you must meet Miss Vane," she said. "She is quite the fixture. A spinster of long standing. She comes to every ball, you know, though I cannot think what she hopes for at her age. We must all be a little sorry for her. It is a charity to be kind." Petra Sedley smiled the smile of a woman who has never once been the object of charity, and inclined her perfect head, and Honoria curtsied to them both, correct and silent, and felt the old word close over her like cold water closing over a stone. Honoria found a place against the long wall beneath the gallery, where the candlelight reached least, and she set herself to the work of being unremarkable, which she had perfected over 8 years, and which had never once failed her. She watched Clara across the room, watched the diamonds turn and the silk move, watched the dowager move, among her guests, like a woman, counting a harvest. The heat of the room pressed close, 200 bodies and 200 candles, and the scent of hothouse roses and warm wax and powder hung over everything. Honoria's gloved hand found the small, hard shape sewn into the seam of her reticule and closed around it, and she breathed, 4 in and 4 out, and waited for the evening to be over the way she had waited for so many evenings to be over. The orchestra struck up. The Duke of Westmere had not yet appeared, and the room had begun to wonder at it, and Lady Caro's confidence had begun to inflate into something visible, a brightness, a quickness in her movements, the look of a general who believes the field already won. She had told the right people the right story. The Vane woman stood alone against the wall as she had always stood. The order was about to confirm itself, as it always had, as it was built to do. And then the great doors opened, and the Duke of Westmere was announced, and he came into the room in his coat of near black blue, and he did not go to the head of the room, where Petra waited in her silver tissue. He stopped just inside the doors, and he looked the length of the ballroom, over the heads of 200 guests, over the diamonds and the candle glare, and the whole bright machinery of the season. And he found the plain woman against the far wall, exactly as he had found her on the first night, and this time he did not incline his head and look away. He began to walk. The room understood before Honoria did. A path opened for him because a path always opened for him, and he did not vary from it, straight down the length of the floor toward the wall where she stood, and the orchestra faltered and recovered, and the dancing thinned, and the talk dropped away in a spreading hush as person after person turned to follow the line of his walking. Lady Caro's fans stopped at the wrong height. Petra's smile held one instant too long, and then did not hold, and Honoria, who had promised nothing, felt her own heart slam against her ribs, and her feet root to the floor, because she had told him she would not be his ruin, and here he was ruining the whole careful evening with nothing but the direction of his steps. He stopped before her. The room was silent now, fully silent. 200 people, and not one of them breathing aloud. He looked at her for a moment that went on past the comfort of anyone watching. Then he bowed. Not the shallow, correct bow he had given her the first night, but a full, deep bow, the bow a man makes to a woman of consequence. And he straightened, and he offered her his hand, and he said in a voice, pitched to carry to every corner of that listening room 12 words, and no more. "I will marry Miss Vane, or I will marry no one." The silence broke the way ice breaks. All at once, and from underneath. Somewhere, a glass was set down too hard. Honoria's hand had risen to his without her deciding it, her gloved fingers in his, and she felt the smooth shape of her mother's thimble pressed between her palm and his, and she could not have said a word to save her life. He did not need her to. He had said the only word that mattered, in the one arena that had spent the whole season unsaying her, And the arena had no answer. Lady Caro found her voice, because women like Lady Caro always find their voice. But it came out wrong, fragmented. The polish cracked clean off it. Westmere, you cannot. The woman is she is nobody. She is. You do not understand what is being said. She stopped. She looked around the room for the agreement that had always been there, the chorus that confirmed her, and she found 200 faces that had just watched a duke cross a ballroom for a spinster against the wall, and the faces were not with her. They were with him. They had always secretly, in the part of themselves the season did not reach, wanted to see exactly this. I understand precisely what is being said, the Duke replied. And now, his voice was quiet again, meant for her, though the room leaned in to catch it. It is being said by you, Lady Caro, and it is false. And you know it to be false, for you wrote it. Miss Vane has thrown nothing in my path. She kept her niece from me to protect my name from your tongue. The only fortune she has hunted is a fallen bird and a frightened child. I have watched her do both when she believed no one watched. He paused. You call her nobody. You have called a great many people nobody, in rooms like this one, with a fan held just so. I had a brother you would have called nobody once he had lost his money. He is dead. I was silent then. I am not silent now. It was the most he would say, and it was more than the room had ever heard him say, and the wound was in it, named at last and only once, and Honoria understood the whole shape of him in that single breath. He had not crossed the room only for her. He had crossed it for the boy. He had not crossed a room for, in time. Yet he had crossed it, and he was crossing it, and his hand was warm and certain around hers, and that was the difference between them and the dead. A figure detached itself from the crowd, an elderly gentleman with white hair and a black coat, and Honoria recognized the family solicitor who managed what little the Vanes had, and she did not understand his presence until he spoke. Your Grace, he said with a small bow, I took the liberty, on your instruction, of confirming the matter we discussed. Miss Vane's settlement is in order. There is no impediment. It was procedural and dry, and it sealed the thing past undoing, because the Duke had not come on impulse. He had come prepared, with the documents drawn and the solicitor waiting at the edge of the room, so that no one, not the dowager, nor the law, nor the gossip, could afterward call it a thing said in heat and taken back in the cold morning. Petra, to the surprise of everyone and most of all herself, was the one who moved next. She crossed to Honoria, the silver tissue whispering, and she studied her a moment with the flat assessing look she had worn the first night, and then the look changed into something younger and more honest. I was told you were a fortune hunter, she said simply. I see that you are not. I am sorry for my part in it. And she curtsied. A true curtsy debutante to the future Duchess. And the last prop of the dowager's stage fell quietly away. Lady Caro left the ball early. No one stopped her. She was not destroyed, only corrected, displaced from a field she had been certain she commanded. And she would tell a different story tomorrow, as such women do. And the new story would have her as a friend to the match all along. The rune let her go. It had found a thing it liked better than her confidence. And the thing was the sight of the Duke of Westmere leading Honoria out onto the floor for the first dance. Slow and deliberate. A man who had not danced in 3 years remembering how. The dance itself Honoria would remember in pieces for the rest of her life. The way one remembers the few minutes that divide a life into before and after. The pressure of his hand at her waist correct and light and unbearably warm through the worn silk, the turn of the room around them. Every face she had spent 8 years evading now openly upon her, and strangely no longer terrible. The Duke did not speak through the whole of it. He had said his 12 words, and had no need of more. Once in a turn, his eyes came down to hers, and the stillness she had taken for coldness was not coldness at all, but the held breath of a man who has wanted something a long while, and is at last permitting himself to have it. When the music ended, he did not release her hand at once. He held it a beat past propriety, in front of all of them, and then he raised it and bowed over it. And the room, which had been built to crush her, applauded. They were married in the spring, quietly, in the small church near Westmere's country seat. With Clara as the only attendant and Beatrice scattering primroses, she had picked herself badly, with the stems too long. There was no crush of 200. There was Honoria in a gown the color of cream, the first new gown in 8 years, and the Duke, with the stillness gone soft at the edges, and an old vicar, and a dozen people who actually loved them, which was 11 more than Honoria had walked through most of her life, expecting. By the following winter, there was snow on the long windows of the house in Derbyshire, and a fire in the nursery hearth, and Honoria sat with Beatrice on one side, and Clara on the other, the three of them watching the flakes come down out of a darkening sky. The Duke stood in the doorway a while before they noticed him, the way he had once stood unseen at a garden door. Only now the watching held no grief in it, only a quiet that had finally found a place to rest. Clara was telling Beatrice the names of birds, the true ones, and the better ones Honoria had taught her, and the child was laughing. On the table beside Honoria, where she had set it down to take Beatrice's cold hands in hers, lay her mother's enameled thimble, blue and gold, and worn smooth at the rim, no longer carried in a glove against the dark, but set out in the open in a warm room, in a house that was hers, beside a fire that would not go out. She did not need to hold it anymore. That was the whole of what had changed, and it was everything. Outside, the snow came down on a window she had at last been permitted to call her own. Inside, the fire held, and the child laughed, and the man who had crossed a ballroom for her stood in the doorway and did not look away. If Honoria's journey stayed with you, I hope it stays a while longer. Thank you for staying until the end.